I'm Crystal Raymond. I'm the Deputy Director of the Western Fire and Forest Resilience Collaborative and a research scientist at the University of Washington. So I'll give an overview of this new research collaborative, and then Claire will follow up with talking about one of our specific projects focused on smoke. So we're a relatively new research collaborative. It is led out of the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies in New York, with scientists from multiple research universities around the West. And this research collaborative is funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation as part of their Wildfire Resilience Initiative. And for this audience, I probably don't have to say too much about kind of the conundrum of fire and forests in the Western US. You're all probably pretty aware of this, but just to kind of lay it out a bit, we recognize that fire is critical to forests throughout the Western US. These forests have burned for millennia. And yet at the same time, people are increasingly experiencing the detrimental consequences of wildfire, whether that's being directly in the path of a wildfire or experiencing the smoke effects. And these are some pictures of just some of those major wildfires throughout the West in the last couple of years. And so the goal of the Fire Collaborative is really to produce actionable science across the West to help decision makers have additional information when thinking about how to steward and manage forests during this time of profound change, and particularly recognizing the impacts of climate change on both forest resilience and fire. And so we focus on developing actionable science that directly addresses the needs of decision makers. And this is also underpinned by innovative and interdisciplinary research on fire and forest resilience. And so I'll talk about a couple of our different research areas. So we have 4 primary research areas. So focusing on mechanisms of forest resilience, tracking forests and fire, projecting forests and fire, and then the consequences of all that for ecosystem services. And then a key part of this is what we call the community of practice. So recognizing that the science is going to be most effective at influencing decision makers if it's developed with significant engagement from policy and research managers or resource managers. And so we're integrating that throughout the different research areas. And we have a pretty big team of scientists. You may recognize a lot of these folks. So these are the different scientists that are leading those research areas from institutions across the West, including here at University of Washington, as well as multiple UC schools and University of Colorado. And we started this process with a pretty intensive planning year, trying to do a fair amount of engagement with decision makers and resource managers throughout the Western US. So we had 20 one-on-one interviews, 4 regional meetings, and 40 practitioners and researchers attended a town hall meeting in Los Angeles to really kick off the program. And from that process, we kind of walked away with 4 main knowledge gaps that have been integrated throughout the research agenda for the Fire Collaborative. So one is focusing on metrics that differentiate good versus bad fire. So that was something that was shared by many people working in decision making. Development of reliable indicators of resilient pre-fire forests. And then we heard a lot about the need to be able to kind of scale insights from the ground to larger scales to the Western US. So thinking about how to scale scientific insights across those different scales. And so I'll talk just a little bit briefly about each of those research areas and what we're focusing on. So the group focusing on mechanisms of forest resilience is using different techniques. So all of these 4 research areas that I mentioned are trying to make use of innovative and different techniques, from field-based work to modeling to remote sensing and machine learning. And so for the forest resilience group, this is focused mainly on field work and modeling to really understand the mechanisms behind forest resilience and wildfire. This year we'll be doing a big field campaign, and then there's also modeling, from the individual plant and stand scale to understand forest resilience and fire mechanisms. We have a group looking at tracking forests and fire, and just give you some examples of what this group is working on. One is this fire behavior product. So some of you may have seen a paper that just came out recently in Science that is focused on the fastest growing and most destructive wildfires in the West. And so this is related to the fire behavior work that we're doing that's really focusing on daily fire spread, and recognizing that that spread rate is really critical to understanding what fires are most destructive when we think about protecting infrastructure and the wildland-urban interface. And then another key research area of this group is fire severity. And this builds off the work that Brian Harvey has done on fire severity. And he's expanding that from the Northwest to the Western US. And so I think he's given a presentation to this group as well. And so part of that focus is to move from some of our remotely sensed metrics on fire severity to really ecologically meaningful metrics of fire severity, such as distance from seed source, and understanding how different patches of fire severity result in distance from seed source and what that can mean for the potential of forest to regenerate following wildfire. So it gives you kind of two examples of the type of research being done by this group. And I also want to give you an example of the type of kind of what we're calling decision-ready products, or products from that research that then produces actionable science that can support decision makers in managing wildfire. And so one of these is this product that's looking at a metric for measuring beneficial fire or good fire across the Western US. And so this is a product in prep where we have looked at wildfire across the Western US and categorized how much of that fire burned in what could be considered ecologically beneficial fire, based on the idea that if the fire burns with a fire severity that's consistent with the historical fire regime in that area, then that's likely having some ecologically beneficial effects. And so that turns out to be, a pretty significant amount of the wildfire area in the Western US is burning in what could be considered ecologically beneficial fire. And so another group is looking more at projecting forests and fire into the future. And so this group is using primarily modeling techniques and developing a dynamic model that can simulate fire and forest dynamics across all forested area in the Western US. And to do so under multiple different climate change scenarios. And so I think what's kind of different and unique about this is the ability to project these changes in fire regimes at the scale of the Western US, which hasn't been done with a dynamic fire model yet. And at the same time, to be able to incorporate changes in forest ecosystems themselves, so changes in the vegetation and potential feedbacks between climate-driven changes in the fire regimes and changes in the vegetation. And so the graph here on the right is showing, projected increases in acres burned by wildfire across the Western US from one climate change scenario. And another thing we can do with a dynamic modeling framework like this is to really ask some big kind of what if questions about managing fire and forest in the West. And what I mean by that is kind of, these big scale questions about how do we prioritize treatments? For example, across the Western US, prioritizing treatments in the wildland-urban interface or more dispersed throughout forest areas, and thinking about the scale of treatments, how much treated area is needed to really make a difference in things we care about, like number of fires in the wildland-urban interface, or total area burned, or effects on forest ecosystems. So I think it offers, a really exciting tool to be able to ask some of these big what-if policy questions, to get a sense of if, the general direction and ideas about how we can be more strategic in the management actions that are taken to address wildfire. And so then the last group is really focused on, taking this information about changing fire regimes and forest resilience and using a number of different techniques to model or determine what it means for different ecosystem services. And so we have scientists who are looking at carbon storage, water provisioning, biodiversity, changes and trends in the wildland urban interface, and then of course the wildfire smoke impacts. And so that's what Claire is going to be talking about today. And so, yeah, it seems like we'll have a chance for discussion questions, but I'd be really interested in hearing from people about what they see as the benefits of and potential opportunities for this West-wide research program. So hopefully we'll have some time to discuss that. If you'd like to learn more, here's our website. We have a QR code as well, and we have started up a newsletter, and I'd encourage you all to subscribe to the newsletter to hear about more of what we're working on.
But yeah, thanks so much. My name's Claire Schollaert. I'm a postdoc at UCLA in the School of Public Health in the Environmental Health Sciences department there. But I currently live in Seattle. I did my PhD at UW and wasn't quite ready to leave the Northwest, so I work remotely up here. But yeah, Crystal just provided a really wonderful overview of the full WFFRC, or the full collaborative ecosystem. And I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about one small piece of this larger effort, which is one of these bottom spokes here from the diagram that Crystal had up, specifically focusing on the air quality portion of this larger narrative. I'm an environmental health researcher who spends a lot of my time thinking about the challenge that is estimating wildfire smoke exposure. And I've found myself through this project and through some earlier work, working with some really wonderful forest ecology modelers to figure out how we can leverage the really cool work that they're doing to model and project forest and fire dynamics to help us better estimate pollutant emissions and feed that into further work looking at air pollution and health impacts. So I know there's been numerous wonderful presenters during this series who have talked about health impacts of exposure to wildfire smoke, so I don't really feel a need to harp on why we care about this. That's probably obvious to most people in this group. But I'm going to talk about our current early stage effort to get at those air quality and health questions, starting from that ecological modeling piece, what some of the cool benefits are of this approach that we're taking and where we're encountering some growing pains within this interdisciplinary modeling process. So Crystal got at this a little bit through the wonderful intro she just gave, but this is a diagram that certainly helps me get a general overview of this genre of forest ecology models that we're talking about here. I'm an environmental health researcher. This sort of ecological modeling is not my area of expertise, and I'm fairly certain that there's at least a few folks on this call here who probably don't spend all their time thinking about forest and fire ecology modeling. So it's hopefully useful. There are really, a range of models out there that can simulate vegetation effects on fire or fire effects on vegetation. Some models can dynamically look at, both directions, looking at feedbacks between the two. But these models are largely built on things like experimentally derived relationships, satellite-derived relationships, field studies, all to simulate vegetation and fire dynamics under different climate, topography, weather dynamics at a very wide range of spatial and temporal scales. So there's some, very fine scale models that can simulate forest dynamics at a single tree scale or fire spread at an hourly scale, for example, all the way up to landscape level models that can simulate ecosystem change over the course of decades. And so one such landscape level model is this one called DynaForest, and it's a model that was developed by some WFFRC colleagues to simulate dynamic feedbacks between fire and forests, making it really great not only for simulating what forest and fire has looked like historically across the landscape, but it's also really great for looking to the future and testing out different climate scenarios or forest management scenarios, as Crystal mentioned, and seeing how forest structure and subsequent fire may respond in light of those changes. So what's really great for us on the air quality side of things, is that the model spits out all of these outputs related to things like biomass and fire characteristics and combustion, all at a 1 kilometer resolution that we can then take to calculate emissions. Meaning all those fires that they can simulate historically, we can then understand the emissions impacts, and then all the management and climate scenarios that they can test moving forward, we can then also start to understand what the air pollution impacts may be under those possible futures. So how do we get there? This is a methods framework that we've developed as part of a previous project that is, useful for thinking about how to link model inputs and outputs across disciplines, showing how you get from the forest and fire ecology side of things all the way down to the public health health impact side of things. So each of these steps can sort of be agnostic to the exact model you use in each of these, but the high-level workflow is to take outputs from a forest and fire model to calculate pollutant emissions for individual fire events. We then can throw those emissions estimates into an air pollution model to estimate pollutant concentrations that we can then link to population data sets and apply what we know from the existing wildfire smoke epidemiological literature to estimate relative health impacts. So think asthma-related emergency department visits, for example. So just to provide a super quick example of how we've used this approach previously, this is from a project we did a few years back in collaboration with the Nature Conservancy as part of a SNAP project, where we partnered with the Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative, which is a 2.5 million acre landscape in the Central Sierra, where 6 forest management scenarios had been developed that ranged in the amount and the type of treatments that were applied to the landscape. A breakdown of those scenarios can be seen on the bottom left here. And so this group was interested in evaluating these scenarios from a very wide range of outcomes, including the air quality and health impacts from both wildfire and prescribed burns. So I just wanted to provide a very quick snapshot of the types of data and analyses we can get from this type of approach. So all of these different scenario options were thrown into a landscape ecology model, in this case, Landis. We then use the emissions estimates from fires simulated within Landis as inputs into HighSplit to estimate downwind PM 2.5 concentrations. So you can see what that looks like at a very aggregate level in this middle panel here for each of the different scenario options. And then we could take those daily concentrations we got from HighSplit and use a health impact function with relative risk estimates from an existing meta-analysis of wildfire smoke impacts on asthma, and look at, for example, on the right side here, statewide change in annual asthma-related hospitalizations relative to a business as usual scenario that may occur if any of these management options were implemented on the landscape. So I throw this up here not to get into any of these specific results, but to really showcase how we can start to translate a lot of the scenario development and evaluation work that's happening in the forest management space across the Western US right now, and translate that into some understanding of how those scenarios may impact people from an air quality and a health perspective. That said, if you are interested in learning more about that specific project, I've just thrown the QR code up here for one of our papers on it. But back to WFFRC and what we're doing as part of the collaborative, and how we're scaling this approach up to the full Western US, which is the spatial domain of the collaborative as a whole. So we have this framework again, where in this case, we're using DynaForest as our forest and fire model, which we can use to calculate emissions that we can then throw into an air pollution model. Our intention is to first run a historical analysis and then start looking to the future as our DynaForest arm of the collaborative starts working on their future simulations. As I mentioned, we are in the earlier stages of this project, so we're focusing first on this second emission step here. And so in the specific case of using DynaForest outputs to generate wildfire emissions, we're using this bottom-up approach that requires burn area estimate, biomass loading, fraction burned, and then some set of emissions factors, which are estimates we get from the literature that relate biomass burned to specific pollutant quantities for various emitted chemical species. This is just a breakdown of the emissions factors we're using as of now. DynaForest breaks things down by plant functional type, which we can then group based on what emissions factors are available in the most recent literature for both live and dead biomass. You'll see the vast majority of the modeling domain falls into this conifer forest category. So we've used this approach to calculate some preliminary emissions estimates, which we can then aggregate annually across the full study region to compare to estimates from other existing biomass burning emissions inventories that we have available to us. And this is what that looks like. So here we have annual PM 2.5 emissions in red from DynaForest compared to several other global satellite-derived emissions inventories, which vary in their spatial resolution and the methods used to produce them. But what you'll notice is that over time, going back over the past couple of decades or so, pattern-wise, we see that things track pretty well annually, with the emissions from DynaForest in this red line falling sort of middle with lower end of the pack relative to some of these other inventories. Part of this lower bias could be due to the fact that DynaForest is trained on fire perimeters from MTBS, so it only includes fires greater than 1,000 acres. So we're not including any smaller fires in these emissions estimates. Dynaforest is still being tweaked as well, so things could certainly shift due to improvements in how the model simulates things like biomass or combustion. But from this very aggregated level, we can at least have some confidence at this point that the way that Dynaforest is simulating historical fire is doing a pretty decent job in allowing us to capture, year-over-year trends in total emissions. What's really exciting for us, though, is that this plot only goes back to 2003. And that's because that's really as far back as any of these other inventories go due to limitations in the satellite record. I will say as a caveat, GFED does go back to 1997. But with Dynaforest and the outputs we're getting from that model, we can actually go back much, much further than that to generate this emissions record for the Western US that has not previously existed, all the way back to the 1950s. So this is really huge for us in terms of being able to extend that emissions record, in part because that means we can then put these historical emissions into some air pollution model and estimate what smoke exposure has looked like for a longer time period instead of being limited to exposure data that starts back in the 2000s. This is just a quick spatial comparison of total annual county level emissions totals relative to the most recent version of FIN, which is a bottom-up 1 kilometer global biomass burning emissions inventory. I've just pulled FIN out here because it matches Dynaforest most closely in spatial resolution and also uses the same bottom-up approach, combining burn area, biomass loading, biomass flux, and the same set of emissions factors we're using for our Dynaforest calculations. The black dots on each of these maps represent the simulated fire locations from Dynaforest. So on the left, you can see there's decent agreement across Washington, Oregon, and California, also into Idaho. Correlation coefficients tend to be lower in counties with fewer fires, as you might expect. The right map is showing relative difference across FIN and the Dynaforest emissions estimates, and we generally see lower differences across the coastal states, again, with larger discrepancies in places like Arizona, New Mexico, which likely corresponds to differences in how model performs across ecoregions. Finally here, I just have some maps showing the spatial distribution of fire locations simulated by Dynaforest with the colors representing the magnitude of PM 2.5 emissions from each individual fire. So I've got fires for the full 70-year study period over here on the left, and then maps showing what that time period broken down into 4 sub-periods on the right. And it's a little bit hard to see, but generally we see higher emissions in places like Western Washington, as we would expect, where we see these more intense West Side fires. If we look over time, we can see how the number of fires have really ramped up, particularly over the past couple decades. Less frequent fire in the middle of the 20th century, it starts to pick back up. You can see the 1988 Yellowstone fires down in this map over here. And then, of course, highest density of fire ignitions over the past 20 years. This is obviously a very high-level descriptive view. As I said, we're early days, but we're excited to start to take a deeper dive into some of these emissions estimates as we move forward with the process. Okay, so I mentioned we're still, early stages of this particular effort, but I wanted to highlight what we think is cool about this approach, what some of the bumps in the road have been, and where we're going and what our next steps are. So what's exciting about linking up with these forest and fire models is that it gives us this opportunity to generate this extended emissions inventory that we can't get from the satellite record. It also allows us to look at these varying scales of fire impacts down to the single fire, up to the landscape or the regional level. It also sets us up really well to be able to tweak emissions and evaluate future air quality impacts of different forest management scenarios and climate change. As Crystal mentioned in her intro, that's, I think, something we're all particularly excited about. There are, of course, challenges to this approach. One is reconciling the temporal resolution. In the case of Dynaforest, this is not the case with all forest and fire ecology models, but in the case of Dynaforest specifically, the fire outputs we're getting are currently only at the monthly scale, which obviously makes it challenging for us to estimate daily emissions and air pollution impacts, which is where we would ideally like to be from a public health perspective. So we're trying to currently come up with some creative proxies to deal with that. Another challenge, which I alluded to earlier, is that Dynaforest itself is under development, always improving. It is a state-of-the-science model, which makes it really cool. But it can be a bit challenging from a workflow perspective to figure out when we should grab what is that final version of the emissions data to move forward with into our air pollution dispersion modeling, the more computationally expensive part of our process. It's not an unusual problem when you're linking model inputs to different model outputs, particularly across disciplines, but it is something we're dealing with. That all said, our next steps are, of course, to take our emissions estimates from DynaForest and use them to model downwind pollutant dispersion, first historically, as I mentioned, and then into the future to test out some future management and climate scenario impacts on smoke exposure. We're then hoping to use those smoke exposure estimates to do some relative health impact analyses, as well as some more in-depth exposure analyses focused on vulnerable populations. For example, outdoor ag workers, our group we know are disproportionately exposed to smoke from wildland fires, and a group that our research group has been particularly interested for a while in now. So I can stop there, and I'm happy to take questions. I know Crystal is as well. I know we have a few discussion points as well that we can chat about, but I just wanted to throw the QR code for the WFFRC website back up here if you all wanted to join the mailing list, get in touch with us, learn more about what we're working on, and then, of course, my personal email as well is up there.
Excellent. Thank you for packing a lot of information into a short amount of time from both of you. Those are really helpful overviews. I'm sure there are questions, and yeah, if people want to come off of or turn their videos on, I'll start off. Well, I have two questions. One for Crystal. So you're showing your distribution of participants for the WFRC across the Western US. Do you have some formal or informal engagement across the border into Canada? I mean, we have participants here from Alberta and BC, and clearly the fires don't really care about the border. So can you just comment on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So currently our kind of research and modeling domain covers the Western US and does not include Canada. However, we are working, we have a lot of kind of collaboration and partnership with other grantees of the More Wildfire Initiative, and that includes this program called the Sparks, which I forget what that stands for. But the Sparks are local groups that are working on kind of fire management kind of locally, and looking at, if you increase the amount of resources in an area and really address what are the biggest challenges in that area, can you help, move the needle in terms of people living sustainably with wildfire? And I mentioned that program because there is a Spark community in BC. There's also one in Alaska. So, we've had some interactions with them. We're partnering with the Sparks. And, for example, our ecologically beneficial firework is something that we're developing with their input. And so, we've heard a lot from the Sparks in BC, and that's definitely, a group that we've connected with. But currently, the modeling and the research doesn't cover that area. Winslow Hansen, who's the director of this program, he also does quite a bit of work in Alaska and has some other research going on there on fire and forest resilience. And so there's also kind of creates a bit of a continuum, BC being in the middle there, meaning that some of the work may be relevant to different parts of BC. But, one of the challenges that's also come up in that is this idea of recognizing the differences in the sources of data, differences in type of data quality, data availability. So although the wildfires don't cross the border, or don't care about the border, sometimes the data that's available does.
And maybe just to add to that quickly, while the fire model doesn't extend beyond the Western US through the specific smoke modeling portion of this, we most likely will be able to look at smoke that is crossing the border stemming from fires that will be happening in the US. So we'll potentially be able to look at smoke impacts, but not from, BC fires specifically, for example.
Great, thank you. And my second question is, I just was sent the PNAS paper, Claire, by Ma et al. About, where's the title of this? Long-term exposure to wildland fire smoke, PM 2.5, and mortality in the contiguous US. And the bottom line is there's a lot of extra people being killed by wildfire smoke, but so what in terms of being able to influence the political system? And I'm just wondering if, I mean, clearly you're both scientists focusing on the science questions, but are you also, as part of your consortium, thinking about how do you present the science differently so that it can actually have some impact? Because we have enough evidence that these are really major problems that aren't getting enough attention or funding. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, and then we'll go to Liz.
Yeah, great question. I'll also just highlight that the long-term health impacts of chronic smoke exposure is still, sort of in the earlier stages of, what we know about that topic specifically, where a lot of the previous research has been focused on short-term acute exposures. So that's an area that's a bit ripe for further work. And I guess I am biased to thinking about smoke specifically. But I think one of the places where we can move the needle that both Crystal and I touched on a little bit is thinking about management impacts and thinking about smoke exposure trade-offs specifically is something I'm really interested in. And being able to put some numbers to the wildfire prescribed burn smoke exposure trade-off. We are quite data poor in that area specifically, and I know it's something that a lot of air quality regulators at the state and national level are thinking about a lot right now, and I'm hoping we have a little bit of leverage to move the needle in that space specifically. I don't know if Crystal has additional thoughts on that though, more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, I can add a little bit to that. And I talked about this modeling framework that we're setting up that allows us to, ask management and policy relevant questions. So for example, looking at different scenarios of, how much forest in the Western US is treated, whether that be through fuels reduction treatment that doesn't involve fire or prescribed fire. And then, kind of ask the questions, well, how much does that make a difference in the wildfire smoke production? So, how much area do you have to treat in order to make a difference in something like that? And how much of a difference do you make? Also thinking about, who's affected, right? So looking at different areas that you may treat, and then how does that change, where the smoke is, and looking at where the smoke is for prescribed fire versus wildfire smoke gives us an opportunity to say, how are people differently affected by these different management options? So I think, that's the biggest challenge, right? We recognize that fire is a key part of these systems, that fire is not going to go away. We have to figure out how to be living sustainably with wildfire. But at the same time, the more we can understand about the potential to affect the smoke production and the air quality, then, that can be a key piece of figuring out how we do that.
Great, thanks. Liz, and then Jeremy, and others, feel free to raise your hands and ask questions.
I just wanted to ask, where is this Sparks community in BC? Because I've never heard of this before.
Yeah, I should know that. I was wondering if by any chance, if someone from the Sparks is on the call who might know that, but off the top of my head, I don't know, and I should know.
We'll
but
look it up.
I can
Okay.
look it up and send it to you. Yeah.
Put it in the chat, but yeah, I mean, I sort of have open-ended questions, but maybe I'll just wait until we get to the more pointed questions because I feel like they could be more relevant then. But I'm an artist, but I'm getting ready to start doing a research project on sort of like how, like, in this idea of like coexisting with fire, how do communities like emotionally, psychologically, spiritually live well with fire, and hoping to put forward I'm putting forward a grant application in February that would be looking at sort of from the more like humanities approach, which I know is definitely out of like scientists' wheelhouse because my brother's a atmospheric physicist, and whenever we talk about climate change, I'm like, are you allowed to talk about feelings in your job? And he's like, no, absolutely not. But have you seen any of this side of the research happening in the States? Because I'm mostly looking at stuff like that happening in Canada, but have you seen anything going on in the States?
Anybody want? Crystal, go ahead.
Yeah, and so you're talking about kind of specifically like thinking about how people are kind of mentally affected by.
Yeah, I mean, because I guess I see like very kind of direct psychological research, and it's like, okay, we see rates of anxiety and depression and addiction go up, in communities, and that there are different communities who are affected more than others. But yeah, I don't know. I guess it's more about the resilience building, and again, this idea of like coexisting with fire that I'm not finding people are doing yet. I was like, maybe it's me.
Yeah,
maybe it's a gap in the research. Yeah.
No, I've definitely heard other people in the public health arena. I've worked with Washington State Department of Health and talking about kind of the mental health aspects of being something that they're getting a lot more concerned about, a lot more interest about. I don't know specifically how much research is going on in that area, But I think it's really emerging as like, oh, this is perhaps a health effect of wildfire and smoke that we've kind of understudied or sort of underappreciated the impact that it's happening. So I think it's a really great question. And I don't know for sure if there's any emerging research on that.
I'll just add that Crystal mentioned that at the beginning of their process, they did a number of interviews, and we did the same when we were setting up this group in 2019. And one of the themes that emerged as being a knowledge gap was mental health impacts of wildfire smoke, particularly on firefighters, but also on communities. And there's a couple of comments in the chat about this as well. Thank you for those. Jeremy.
I had a couple of questions. The first one has to do with how you account for weather. You talked about emissions factors varying by forest type and such, but the fire triangle tells us that weather, topography, and fuels all determine fire behavior, and I would submit fire effects as well, but the weather is probably the most important of those drivers, and if you don't account for it, I don't know how you're able to go back casting previous emissions or forecasting forward unless you have some kind of knowledge or information or assumptions about what the weather is going to be in the past or the future. And I was wondering how you address that.
Yeah, great question. So the forest and fire model itself is forced with climate data at various different spatial and temporal scales. And then once we get to the emissions and air pollution dispersion modeling portion of that, one of the primary drivers of all of the air pollution models we use will be meteorological inputs primarily, and particularly the more, simple high split like particle dispersion models are almost, solely driven by meteorology. But that is certainly one of our limitations in this, namely because one, it's the biggest limiting factor on our spatial resolution. And we may be able to estimate emissions back to the 1950s, but I highly doubt we're going to be able to have a meteorological input data sets that allows us to actually look at dispersion back that far. We're probably looking at mid-80s at this point, unless we get quite creative. So that will be a limiting factor and something we're working through right now, but we're hoping at least at a fairly coarse spatial resolution, we can go back to the 1980s. And then, we get into the future climate piece, and we're working with some groups down in California who are doing a lot of downscaling of various climate models to drive both the future projections of the forest and fire model, and then lining it up with how we can then model smoke dispersion, ideally using this same input climate data sets.
I would expect that wind is a pretty important piece of that, and it seems to be one of the most poorly predicted in the climate models. And there's a lot of climate models out there. When you array them all up, there's a pretty wide variation in those kind of future predictions. So what does that do to the confidence intervals? And speaking of confidence intervals, there's a lot of models linked together here. And have you tried to do any kind of a overall error model that describes, how much uncertainty is added in each of these pieces, and what does that finally amount to when you get to a projection?
Not yet, but it is in our plans to do so. Of course, as you said, as we're stacking model on top of model on top of model, we are just stacking our uncertainties on top of each other at this point. So that will certainly be part of our analysis moving forward. We're still early days. The wind projections is something we've really struggled with in the past in previous work because, as you said, the future projections of wind are so uncertain, particularly at those finer spatial resolutions. And how we've resolved that in the past, we don't have a good answer for that at this point. How we've resolved it in the past is using some contemporary wind in combination with other projections of things like temperature and precipitation. We're exploring ways to tackle that right now with some of the downscaling groups down at UCLA, some of the dynamically downscaled data sets, and thinking about how wind performs in some of those newer products. But wind projections, because it's such a crucial component of the dispersion modeling portion of this, is something we're actively working toward thinking about, and it is probably one of our largest challenges.
Is anyone working on the social science side of this to look at how much accuracy is required to address the kinds of priority questions that people have? Like if you're off by a factor of 2 or by 25% or by a factor of 10, is it still useful? Like how far off can it be and still be useful for addressing the questions people have? Because that might provide some guidance as to where to tighten things up.
Yeah, that's a good question. We've talked a little bit about how we can loop in the social science piece of this. Crystal, I don't know if you have specific comments on that.
Yeah, so yeah, we haven't on that specific area. And so yeah, I mean, I think that that's something to think about. And, as we increase the engagement with decision makers, I mean, that's the kind of question we can ask, how much of a difference does it make? What's the level of detail you need in order to be able to have the science that supports the decision that you're trying to make. And so we don't have social scientists actively involved in that question, but I think it's a really good question and something we can get at as we think about the different types of scenarios, management scenarios that we would test.
Thanks.
And Jeremy, and then John, who's about to ask a question, you might comment about the presentation you're doing next month.
Yeah, but good. Yeah, and Jeremy's question, about the social science and what's the level of difference that we have is good segue into my thoughts in this next step, and maybe we'll end up kind of going there in January as well. But first off, what a great model tool and what an excellent presentation today. Because these kinds of stacked models things I usually get all wrapped up in, and I actually tended to kind of follow what you were doing today. So thanks again for that. Yeah, the question or maybe the next step of this discussion and where society goes with it, I think is, this is yet another example of how this information comes together to a pretty clear path for the future that we've been talking about for a decade or more in terms of increasing the pace and scale of both mechanical treatments and prescribed burning treatments. And even recently, over the last few years, we've had a dump of billions of dollars to get this work done. And yet, we are not making much progress to it. So how do you think, what do you think are the barriers to that from your perspective? I mean, I can weigh in on that, but what do you think the barriers are, and how your tool matched with others that are coming out is going to help us actually take a progressive approach to the future and get away from this idea that preservation works, that we're going to have to take on some active conservation on our lands.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think what I'm seeing and I'm hearing a lot about is the sort of acceptance of living with wildfire. And I think, what does that really mean? Like, and sort of recognizing that, we still have, the media is still going to keep talking about big destructive wildfires, wildfire is bad. And obviously it is, right? Huge societal consequences. And yet at the same time, it's not going to go away, right? Like, we're going to have to kind of accept that it's a question of, when the fires are going to happen, not if. And so what does that mean to then kind of change that public dialogue around wildfire and sort of recognize, like, we all live with wildfire, we're going to have to live with wildfire. And how does that, change the way that we kind of integrate acceptance of wildfire within our management. And I mean, it's a huge, we have just entire agencies and a huge paradigm around fire suppression and putting fires out. And even though there's been change and recognition that we can't continue to do that, it's still a big shift towards kind of this idea of like, okay, we're going to have fire, and yet how do we best protect people? And what does that amount of fire look like in the future? And so I think that's kind of the shift that, multiple different people are, trying different ways to help that shift happen. I think communications is a huge piece of it. And then really having clear science that's communicated in a way that, shows the key messages that support decision-making is another piece of it that we're really focused on.
How about the proactive management and prescribed burning?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a part of it, right? And that's happening. That's not happening at the scale that it needs to happen. Could it ever happen? I don't know. How much do we need to be accomplishing, what sort of goals, I think, are the questions we have. I think that the ecologically beneficial firework has also been pretty interesting in seeing, you know, how that wildfire, you know, the extent of wildfire as a treatment itself, and how can we, you know, sort of accept that more as a society, and what does it mean to do that, right? If that a lot of the wildfires actually burning with relatively low severity and is essentially a treatment, right? And so if you can manage that in such a way that you know, the communities are protected, the air quality issues can be addressed in terms of people being able to protect themselves, then, you know, perhaps recognizing more the beneficial effects of wildfire is a way that is, you know, far more feasible in terms of getting area treated than prescribed burning and fuel treatments themselves.
And maybe taking that one step further and thinking about how I see the tools that we're working on specifically addressing some of these barriers, thinking specifically about, you know, air quality related, you know, community acceptance, community risk perception related barriers, air quality regulatory related barriers, and getting treatments done within the confines of smoke management plans and, you know, national air quality regulation. I'm hoping that through, you know, sort of this multi-scale type of analysis we can do, there's a growing interest, I think, in evaluating these management plans that are popping up at the state and regional level all across the Western US, thinking about, you know, like the 20-year Forest Health Strategic Plan in Washington and things like that. I think there's a growing interest in taking that one step further and thinking about, you know, air quality impacts from different options within strategic plans like that. And that's where I see, you know, ideally some of the tools that we're working on fitting into some of those efforts. And then I think, you know, the next step from that, beyond just providing data to actually be able to quantify some of the smoke exposure trade-offs that, you know, are driving the regulatory and the community acceptance barriers, are, you know, my ideal pie in the sky want from this is that if we can have a better understanding of who and where is going to experience specific smoke impacts from, you know, fuel treatments or avoided or worsened wildfire smoke exposure impacts, that is just information that can go into further preparedness and coordination with local and state level public health agencies. And that coordination, I know, needs to be ramped up sort of across the board, but the more information and the more we can feed those collaborative efforts between agencies, I think the better we're going to be able to say, like, okay, you're working on a 2-year public health budget. We're anticipating fuel treatments in X region. So we could anticipate like a few communities getting smoked out from having fuel treatments in, you know, a specific area. Can we think about ramping up, you know, budgeting for mass distribution, clean air centers, et cetera? So that is, you know, several steps down the line, but in terms of like the pathway that I could see our tools, you know, feeding into practice in a very specific, you know, smoke perspective that I think about a lot. That's kind of my long-term hope.
Yeah. Yeah. In this last round with the EPA, they didn't buy into that message very strongly that, you know, a little bit of prescribed fire smoke is better than the big wildfire smoke.
They're still quite conservative on that front, I would say. And I just know anecdotally they're eager for more data around that question specifically. So I'm hoping we can help with that.
Great. I'll just mention that next month, John and Jeremy and one of their colleagues, John Sessions, will be talking about biochar as a byproduct and potential feasibility driver of fire-focused forest management. And but Ben Nichols, since you're on the call, I'm just wondering if you could share a perspective from the perspective of somebody who is involved with fire response and fire management, and how do you use the kind of scientific data that Crystal and Claire are generating, and this question about what level of information is needed to influence policy? I mean, I assume your people are out responding to fires in real time, and you don't sit around at that moment and say, well, what did the study say? But how does that interface with that information interface with the kinds of decisions you have to make?
So for us, the reason why I was excited about jumping onto this today is the emissions and the smoke impacts to prescribed fires. So here in California, and specifically in my neck of the woods in Sonoma County out along the coast, we are trying to bring more good fire to the landscape outside of those catastrophic wildfire events. And so as we increase that scale and pace of fires, we now are dealing with the smoke impacts from larger burns, and it doesn't even necessarily need to be large burns. I mean, this year we had just under 1,000 acres on one burn that had hardly any impact to the civilian population, and then 30-acre burn out on the coast was a catastrophic smoke impact to the lower Russian River. So what we're really struggling with is our compressed burn window for prescribed fire due to concerns from the vintners about smoke taint to grapes. And so right now we've got maybe a week or two right at the end of fire season to implement the larger burns that we're trying to affect, or prior to July 1st. So we've basically been given a window of basically July 1 through middle October, middle to late October, depending on the growing year. But like last year, 2023, because of the late rains, or I'm sorry, the wet winter that we had a prolonged growing season. So those grapes didn't come off the vines until early and mid-November. And so our window was severely compromised. So what we're trying to do, and what I'm trying to do, is bring science to the conversation about what truly are the impacts. I know that there's multiple studies at this point that are being undertaken to address the potential impacts of smoke taint, and then both the smoke taint and public exposure component, more effective smoke plume modeling to be able to articulate or show an average practitioner what that smoke is supposed to do. Because we've got a lot of great examples where the spot weather forecast indicated everything was great, but then when come time for burn implementation, that smoke did not behave as forecasted, and now we have a public backlash on that exposure to the smoke. So just looking for any new facts or research that I can find to help bring that good fire to the landscape. And then here in California, it's, and especially in the state responsibility area, we don't have the opportunity to allow our fires to burn as a management objective because it's not our land, right? It's private property, not a national forest or national park. So that's where we're really focused on that good fire, because I think it was Crystal that mentioned that it's not a matter of if, but when. And so if I can proactively treat it under prescribed fire conditions prior to a catastrophic stand replacing fire, then I think everybody wins.
Excellent. Ben, can you just say who you are and where you work?
Cal Fire, here in the Sonoma Lake Napa unit. I run our operations here in Sonoma County, what we call our West Division of one of the 21 administrative units of the Cal Fire program.
Thank you. And I really appreciate you bringing up the perspective of the wine growers. Just balancing all of these different interests is increasingly complicated, and also requires some scientific study, I think, from political scientists of how do you balance these different decisions. I'll just mention Casey Kula and I are on a governor's committee in Oregon trying to come up with sustainable funding for wildfire response going forward. And around the table are 35 different industries represented, each of whom is saying, yes, this is important, but we're not willing to pay anything more for it. And so I think in many ways, resolving those kinds of conflicts is as important as getting more data about how the smoke moves around. Other comments from people? We still have a pretty good representation here. We're scheduled to stop at 2. I'm happy to keep this going for a few minutes if people want to ask some more questions. And let's see. I'm going to just call on a couple of people. Lita from Idaho, if you're still there. So are you on, Lita? Kobziar? Lita gave a presentation a couple of years ago about how wildfire smoke can transport pathogens across state lines, which was something I think most of us hadn't heard of other than in her article in Science. So I was just curious where that that work stands. But
Hi, Jonathan. I'm a Lita's PhD
Oh.
student, so I can
Perfect.
step in.
Can you comment on how that work is going?
It's going well. We've done several large sampling campaigns with the FASME experiment in Utah through the Forest Service. So that's a large prescribed fire on the Fish Lake National Forest and very high intensity in subalpine fir. And we've gotten a lot of samples from that for both bacteria and fungal spores that are being emitted in wildland fire smoke. And we've also been in Kansas and throughout Idaho and in California a little bit. But we're seeing high concentrations of both bacteria and fungal spores being emitted in fire smoke, both beneficial like nitrogen fixing bacteria, as well as potential human pathogens, mostly fungal human pathogens.
Great. Thank you.
I may reach out. We're doing some preliminary work on valley fever and,
Okay,
and
yep.
smoke early days, but sounds like we should maybe connect.
Yeah, we'd be happy to talk about it.
Cool.
Yeah. I mean, the goal here isn't to get people more paranoid and worried about things, but I think when there is this new kind of data coming out, we want to make sure everybody's aware of it. Anybody else want to add anything here? Eric from FireSmart BC, you want to bring a Canadian perspective to the discussion?
I don't know if I have much to add. Definitely super interesting. A little bit outside of what FireSmart does, but definitely on our radar as, I mean, anyone in Western North America, the interior of BC, we get so much smoke exposure every summer now. It's a pretty persistent thing. And yeah, definitely to echo what Ben was saying about, trying to figure out that balancing act for, municipalities and jurisdictions doing burning or that mitigation work when they have such small windows where they can actually pull that work off. Yeah, very interesting work you guys are doing.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. And I just wanted to give out a shout out to that the spark that I mentioned in BC, if people didn't see in the chat. So that's Smithers, BC, Bulkley Morris watershed. So sorry, I forgot the name there. But glad to see that they're on the call and just wanted to make sure people know where that spark is located in BC.
Great, thanks for following up on that. And Roland, can you just comment on what you put in the chat?
Yeah, this is a message for Ben. You wanted to be able to anticipate smoke from prescribed burns. So I have a link to the Blue Sky Playground tool. This covers all of Canada and most of the US, including most of California. And even though this is run here in Canada, it's based on work done by the Air Fire group in Seattle from the US Forest Service. So yeah, just wanted to point that out to you on the chat.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks. Okay, well, Crystal and Claire, this is really helpful. Greatly appreciate you both being willing to share your work with us, and do come back and let us know. Actually, I did have one other question that I'll stick on. Hi, Lita. Thanks for joining us. The work that you're talking about definitely has urban implications, and we've heard from Brian, your colleague, Crystal, a few times about the increased fires on the western side of the Cascades and the implications for potential but not yet happened conflagrations in the urban areas. I'm just wondering how much of the work of your consortium is looking at those kind of issues, and in particular, if fires do come into the urban areas, who's actually responsible for dealing with it? Because that's still an unresolved issue.
Yeah, so we're definitely not getting into sort of the political management aspects, right, of whose responsibility it is. And I have heard people talk about some of these events being like wind events with fire involved, right, which is an interesting way to flip that around. Maybe that was what you were saying, yeah, when you were talking about it. So I think it's really interesting. So I think that our work can touch on that in a couple of ways. One is the fast fire work. So recognizing that when we're talking about moving into the urban environment, this idea of fire speed and how fast these individual fires can move, I think is just a different way of looking at fire behavior than has been a focus before. Really the how fast can these fires move in a day, I think is really useful information, and seeing how that's changing over time as a way to understand, what parts of our wildland urban interface are directly affected by wildfire. And perhaps that's, further into these urban areas than we've realized. So I think that's some useful research that could help with that. And then the other one I would mention is that, so we're working with Volko Radulov, who models and maps the wildland urban interface. And so he's doing some work looking at trends in that over time, going back further in time to understand how the wildland urban interface has changed and where it's growing fastest, and then also some projections into the future. So where do we see the wildland urban interface growing in the future and expanding at the fastest rate? So that could also sort of highlight some areas where we might see more of those wildland urban interface fires.
Excellent. Thank you. And I will mention that Jennifer Balch will be talking about that fast fire work in this series in May.
Excellent.
We can see
Great.
what they figured out by then, 6 months after the paper came out.
Great.
Couple of other comments in the chat. People need to go. So we'll see you all, or some of you, next month. Thanks again, Crystal and Claire, and have a good holiday, everybody.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity to present.
Yeah, thanks for having us.